My name is Matt Sitter. I am CEO of AFN. At AFN, one of our core beliefs is that change is where opportunity happens. And the best way to take advantage of opportunity out there, to find it in that change, is to have a network that is diverse in experience, expertise, and perspective. So we try and bring together people and have really interesting conversations to be able to do that with our membership. But we also bring together subject matter experts to help us expand our thinking in certain different directions. Today, we've got Shannon Polson with us, personal friend of mine from, I don't know, about 25 years ago. So really good to see you, Shannon. Shannon's the author of The Grit Factor. She is a speaker, founder of the Grit Institute as well. Incredible history that she's got. From a professional perspective, she's worked at very substantial companies, Microsoft and Guidant, in managerial roles. But also, when we think back to some of her earlier history, she was one of the first Apache pilots in the U.S. military. So very impressive. After coming out of Duke, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Youngest woman to climb Denali, which is pretty impressive. And she has summited both Rainier and Kilimanjaro as well, and lives somewhere super duper cold. And I know her husband is a big outdoorsman too, so probably continues to do a lot in the outdoors. Shannon, great to see you. And maybe if you could kick us off and just tell us a little bit about, some of the triad within the Grit Factor, and just frame us up a little bit.
Yeah, Matt, great to be with you, and great to be with all of you who are watching both live and after the fact. It's really an honor to do this work, as I think many of you know. But for the last 10 years, I have been running something that I have called the Grit Institute, which is both training as well as keynotes, presentations, and of course the writing and the research. And when I wrote The Grit Factor, it was really in response to a young lieutenant who reached out to me and asked if I would mentor her as she began the same journey that I had taken a number of years ago, going down to what was then Fort Rucker, Alabama, for flight training and becoming an officer and an aviation leader and a pilot. And I realized at that point that I had already transitioned out of the Army. I had gone through business school. I'd worked in the corporate world. And it had been a while since I had been in the place where she was walking into. And surely there was some way that I could scale what I offered this young leader. And if I did that work, then I wanted to scale the people to whom that work was offered. And that was the genesis of what became the Grit Factor, interviewing dozens and dozens of leaders in the vanguards of their fields. They happened to be women. They happened to be military. They all faced what Stanford law professor Deborah Rhodes calls a double crucible, in the challenges of both the job at hand and sometimes the challenges of the environment as well. So what came out of that Grit Factor and those stories that were so generously shared is what I now call the Grit Triad, and that is commit, learn, and launch. And what that really shows is that grit is not this finite, discrete thing that we pull off the shelf for mile 23 of the marathon, although it's very helpful there as well. But it's really connected to this foundation of commit, which is owning our past, that's owning our story and connecting to purpose. It then goes into the learn phase, which is this deep engagement in the present, and that's building and supporting our teams. That's the art and science of strategic or active listening, and it's the mindset for success and the mindset of grit and resilience. And then that final leg is grounded in the past, deeply engaged in the present, and looking at the future with audacity, the willingness to take risks, to fail, and to face that failure, with authenticity and with adaptability. So really showing this to be a much more holistic concept than we sometimes think about.
Awesome. So that's a great framing for us. And maybe just to make sure that we've got this on record so that we can be on the same spot. Can you just define grit for us so that we're working from the same tune?
Absolutely. Yeah. And in the book, of course, I go back and reference the social science that's gone on at University of Pennsylvania, right, with Angela Duckworth. And she would define, I'll start with her definition, passion and perseverance towards a long-term goal. And I like that a lot. Although I will say that as we came into the COVID pandemic, especially, that long-term goal suddenly seemed to be a little bit elusive because horizons were really unclear. And I think that's much more the place that we find ourselves in the world today, and in what we can perceive as the future of work, is unclear horizons, an unclear opportunity. And so I have really defined grit more as a dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstances, drawing, of course, on that entire triad.
Awesome. Okay, so we've got that as our baseline. I want to go back a little bit right now. So you're from Alaska originally. You decide to go to Duke across the country, and then you make another interesting decision to join the U.S. military, which I don't think is super common out of Duke. What
Not
was
a,
behind the
yeah.
decision to do
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a windy path, which is the case for many of the places that I've ended up in my life. But I think it was ultimately connected to things that were core to who I was. So certainly growing up in Alaska, there was both the spirit and the reality of some adventure and some opportunities that were a little bit unusual as well. Duke was the biggest culture shock of my life, coming from Alaska in the 80s, I will say. And so I did ROTC just to kind of try it out. We did have a little bit of military in my family. My father had been drafted for Vietnam, sent to Alaska instead as a JAG officer. And he was very proud of his service and really proud of having served. But when I got to Duke, I realized that in the late 80s, the economy in Alaska was kind of in the tank, and it was really difficult for our family to sort of justify almost or to support my attendance at Duke. And so I figured I would, in addition to the various jobs that I was working on campus, I would try ROTC. And what it turned it out to be was really an incredible opportunity. And this is in large part thanks to the incredible people and leaders of that program at the cadre at the time, was really an opportunity to connect to some ideas of both service and purpose that I didn't even know really mattered as much or were as strong as they were in my life. And so because of that connection, because of the incredible people that I had the opportunity to be in ROTC with, that was ended up being something that became a really important part of my college experience. And then the decision to go active duty after that is another story, but which I'm happy to go into. But it was an unexpected path. And I was really grateful at the end of the day. I am really grateful that I took the opportunity to try that adventure.
Good deal. Well, and it sounds like there was a lot in there that actually contributed to where you are today. So not a bad thing.
For sure. Exactly. No, it definitely calls on parts of you in ways that I didn't expect at the time. And it ultimately was really important. So
nice.
Yeah.
All right. So pulling back to, you developed some of your grittiness during that time frame.
Sure.
How do you think about developing that in yourself? What are some of the things that you think that we should be doing to allow us to have that?
Yeah, developing grit. I mean, I believe first and foremost that grit is innate to every single one of us. So I have the opportunity to talk to audiences around the world about grit and resilience, and I get to use my pictures and videos from Apache helicopters, and that's really, really neat. But at the end of the day, grit is not just something for military pilots and big mountain climbers, right? Grit is innate to every single one of us. So the key is to recognize that. And then the key is to both find that grit and call on it, and also to develop it. And at the end of the day, it comes down to one pretty simple premise, which is we've got to make ourselves do hard things, right? You've got to do hard things to get good at doing hard things. It's just, I remember speaking at West Point at one point and talking about how you get good at push-ups. You don't get good at push-ups by going for a run, not that you shouldn't do both. You get good at push-ups by doing push-ups, and you get good at doing hard things, at finding that grit inside of yourself in all of those pieces of that triad, right? Commit, learn, and launch, by doing hard things and learning how to draw on those different aspects, learning how to employ those different aspects. And so that's the simple answer.
Okay. Yeah. It's interesting. One of my colleagues and I, we've been talking a lot about, the idea of practice,
Yes.
In like law and in medicine.
Sure.
You practice law, you practice medicine. When we talk about practice in other ways, it's just like you getting ready to do the thing. I think many of the folks that we work with, chiefs of staff, CEOs, they're actually doing the thing all the time. They are in practice all the time. I'm just wondering how you react to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. That is part of the work that we need to do. I think for some of us, and for some people that work for us, right, that is not necessarily what they're doing all of the time. So I think it's a couple of things. Number one is if you're in practice in one part of your life, that's great. I think it's also important to think about ways to expand that into other parts of your life. And that's true for a couple of reasons. But one of those reasons is that when you push yourself in an area where you're not used to pushing yourself, you will be growing in all of the different parts of your life. So when you build grit in one area, you can transfer that to another part of your life. And so that's where I think being in practice all the time is great. Then push yourself in some other areas as well and look at really expanding what you're able to bring to that initial practice.
I like that. So you can choose to do a hard thing in one spot, and that actually gives you the confidence to do it elsewhere and utilize that grit.
Which is exactly something that you should think about when you are running into a block somewhere, right? When you're like, gosh, I just don't know how I'm going to get through this in whatever part of my life it is. Well, that's a great place to say, hey, maybe I'm going to focus on it over here for the next month or two. And then I'm going to borrow from that and bring that into my experience that I'm having trouble with. So those are some great opportunities.
Okay, good
Yeah.
deal. So we thought about this idea of how we think about grit for ourselves.
Yes.
We have leaders in organizations that are members of AFN, and they're
Sure.
thinking about how do we foster grit in others? What are some of the ways that you could think that we help others become more gritty?
Yeah, well, there's both helping others individually, and then there's helping our teams and our organizations, right? And those are all probably, they're all related for sure. And some of the same tactics and techniques, I think, can be brought into that individual coaching, that team coaching, and that organizational development. But one of the things that I would say first is you start by encouraging people to do hard things. And when you do that, you make sure that they have the support that they need to be able to stretch and grow, right? It's not just sort of throwing them into the icy lake. It's making sure that they have some kind of backup so that they are stretched to the point of discomfort. And that's really being connected and engaged with your people on in terms of being one-on-one, or even with your team if it's a smaller team, or of course with a broader organization. So I would say any of these principles can apply at that one-to-one level, at the team level, and at the broader organizational level. The other piece is you really do have to establish a culture that is willing to allow for those stretch goals and for that failure. And I think back to a client, it was a Keynote client, it was a number of years ago now, that was it was a credit union. And they really were trying to help people push themselves and be willing to take on those risks and be willing to fail. And I think we had 8 rehearsals for a virtual presentation. And I was like, wow, I mean, that is not an environment that is allowing people to fail. It just isn't. And so thinking about those different aspects of your environment, I'm not saying rehearsal is not important, of course, but looking at those different aspects of your environment that says, how do we encourage people to take on those risks, to take on those stretch assignments? And that may be, as a leader, and I'm going to switch tacks a little bit here, being vulnerable enough to share your own experience of extending yourself and failing and what that felt like and how difficult that was and how it is you overcame that. So I don't think vulnerability is about showing up necessarily and talking about, how your coffee spilled on you on your car in the morning. I mean, it might be, but it's really about sharing those challenges that you have faced, where you have put yourself out there, and then being willing to support others in doing the same. And so that vulnerability comes into that being willing to develop a culture that allows for failure because of extension, because of pushing ourselves, and then really being able to support that as a leader. So they're all integrally connected.
Great. Well, so the best definition I've ever heard of culture is that's just how things are around here, right?
Right.
And so when you think about this as a cultural element, I think that's really important. When we think about it from a managerial perspective as well, we're saying, hey, we want to give you an opportunity to do hard things,
Sure.
but making sure that they know that we're actually giving you an opportunity to do these hard things for a reason,
Yes.
giving them insight into why you're doing it.
Yes, yes, yes. No, exactly. I think why you do it is important. I did see a note come up from one of the participants that accountability is also important. And it is a both and thing. It's not an either or. Accountability is absolutely important. And I hear this from leaders more and more right now, that's a real challenge because of the many different cultural factors that are playing into what it is that is the workplace today. And I think that I know that you can have both accountability and that ability to let people grow and to fail and to come out of that failure. It's how you manage that as a leader. And that is the art, right? That's the art and the science of knowing how involved to be, how invested to be, how connected to be, so that you can help to encourage those steps into a challenge, but also make sure that people are accountable.
Well, I think that's a really interesting segue. So when we're thinking about the work environment today, hybrid and remote is a lot more common.
Sure.
How is that impacting how you're seeing organizations try to enable people to develop grit for themselves? How is it becoming harder for some of these individuals to actually do it? Are there new challenges coming up where it's just like, all right, you need this new muscle where grit's going to be even more important?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are different muscles, and so grit is always important, and it is more difficult because we're growing new muscles. And if you think about the gym analogies of growing new muscles, or any kind of a sports analogy, I think that's a great way to think about it. But yeah, it is. There are a lot of new muscles that people are being forced to grow, and a lot of new ways that we're being forced to operate. And some people are doing that really well. So I think that it is a mistake to say that it can't be done, or that it's impossible, or there are places that are having everybody come back into the office because they can't manage it remotely. And I'm not, without getting into that too much, there are certainly unique challenges in the current environment. And I would say that there are different ways to lead and there are different ways to manage. They come back to something we haven't talked about as much, which is in that second leg, that deep engagement in the present, right? Building your team and taking care of your team. You have to love your people. You have to love your people, and you have to take care of your people. And I tell this story in some of my keynotes about being promoted to first lieutenant, which is sort of like your advanced driver's permit, right? Your very first promotion in the military. And my battalion commander at the time, who retired as a 2-star general in the Army, said words that I would never forget. And I hope that I can leave them with everybody that I ever have a chance to interact with, which is, the most important job you have, the more power you have, is the responsibility to take care of your people. So if you are taking care of your people, you are connecting with them in a genuine way that works for both people. And that's a dance, right? That's always a dance, depending on the culture, the individuals, and the team. If you're doing that, I think you have the best opportunity to grow in your grit together, right? To grow in your resilience together, to grow those muscles together. But it's critical. You can't let that go. And it's easy to let it go in a virtual environment, and it won't work if you do.
Right. Well, and I think, maybe to connect the dots on one of the things that you were talking about before, when you're looking to develop other people, like the fact that you are caring for them, that, they're important to you, means that you're actually thinking about how you're developing them too, which
That's right.
they're not always doing easy stuff then as well.
That's right. No, exactly. If you're developing your people well, you are giving them stretch assignments. You are encouraging them to grow. You're giving them opportunities for professional development. All of those things that we did in the military, that if you had a good boss and if you were a good boss, and that we do in the civilian world is similar. And that was actually, I think back to an interview that I had to take over a team at Microsoft that had to be turned over, which is an awful thing to have to do, whether it's in the for-profit or the nonprofit world. And I've done it in both. And it's a really terrible thing to have to do. And it's something that it's not really a resume sort of a thing. It's something that I am as proud of as anything that I did in the military or in the civilian world, which was taking this team and having to turn it over and coming out of that with the highest operational health index in the division at Microsoft. And I remember in the interview for that role, my boss really pushing me, or the boss that I would have was really pushing me. And he said, how are you going to think about the people and the team? And I was sort of surprised at the question, because it was innate to how I had been raised in the military that, of course, I'm going to take care of the team. Of course, you take care of your people. But that's not necessarily common, especially when you're doing something like turning over a team. But there are ways to do it even when you're turning over a team. So if you're always thinking about the welfare of your people, if you're always thinking about leadership as service, there's incredible opportunities to make things happen, no matter what the situation is. And so I think there's incredible opportunity there, and insight from that early battalion commander that I hope every leader would take away.
Nice. One of the common threads that we see within AFN, and a personal belief of mine, is there's no such thing as the smartest person in the room.
Yeah.
We can all learn something from each other in some way, shape, or form. And I think that has a tendency to lead into, with AFN, it's people who genuinely want to learn from each other. And there is a degree of humility that goes with that. And one of the things that we often see with humility is, a hesitancy to self-promote, even if that's in the interests of the organization. And I think that first leg that you were talking about in terms of, developing grit, is a lot about that storytelling piece. And I was wondering if you could help us think about, the idea of building up your story in a way that doesn't seem like it is self-promotion just for the sake of the individual, that it's for the good of the organization or for some greater task that you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, that first leg is what we came back to again and again through COVID, but to be frank, anytime there is any organization that is going through even hyper growth, right? Whether it's hyper growth or whether it's market challenges, whatever those challenges are, coming back to owning your story and connecting to core purpose, which is a lengthy exercise, frankly. It's not a back of the napkin sort of a thing at all. It really involves, multiple steps in the process, which I have at the end of chapter 1 of the Grit Factor for story, and purpose, of course, is number 2. And then we go into more training at the Grit Institute that blows out purpose even more in a 6-week training. And the reason is that important. And what I would encourage leaders to think about, especially if you've come from the military, and I know writing the Grit Factor, I've told you this, Matt, and I wrote about this in the book as well. It was almost impossible for me to get past this barrier of writing we, because you think of yourself as we. So to say I was really difficult. But at the end of the day, I can only own my story, right? I can't own anybody else's story. And so that's number 1. There is some humility in that, although it may come across in your own mind initially as something different. There's some humility in saying, I can only own my own story. This is my perspective. As a leader, people want to follow people who have been thoughtful about their stories and thoughtful about their purpose. And so being able to articulate your story is not only important for your own well-being and your own integrity in terms of how it is that you show up in the world, but it's also important for others to see that as an example. And so understanding that is a really important part of this. The third piece, I would say, is something every single author and every single person who goes out there on their own has to realize at some point, because it feels sort of funny to put yourself out there, right? And Matt, you and I were just back at our 20th Tuck School of Business reunion, and I remember somebody saying, yeah, I see you all over LinkedIn, and it felt sort of weird when they mentioned that because they were at a big company, and of course, that's not how they do things there. But you almost have to think about it as you are offering the best of what you have to the world. And they're not going to know about it. Seth Godin talks about this really well, by the way. They're not going to know about it unless you put yourself out there and unless you offer that best visibly so that people can find you, so that people can benefit from the knowledge and the wisdom that you have. And when you share in the course of that knowledge and that wisdom, your story with humility, saying, hey, there were these times that I failed. When I get up and give a keynote, it's not, or even write the Grit Factor, it's not because I had that all figured out. It's because most of the time I messed it up. And most of the time I had to find a way through that to recover from that failure and to learn and to grow. And some of it was learning and growing in the writing of the Grit Factor, not while I was a leader. So when you're able to own that piece and that humility, I don't think anybody's going to think that you're coming across in any way other than that, hey, I want to share this so that you can learn and grow. And hey, I really fell down here. This was really tough for me. This is how I got through it. Let me see how I can help you get through it. So I think those 3 different ways hopefully will help any leader that is having any trouble with sharing their story to really think about that as an important aspect of leadership communication and an important part of leadership.
Awesome. Okay. So yeah, and I think there's a lot that we can take away from that. And, there is a lot that we can share. Yes, we can have humility and still be willing to learn from others. But, if we're holding back what we've learned, you're actually, not giving everyone the tools that they might want to use in the future.
Exactly. That's right.
All right. So, you wrote the Grit Factor, what was that, like 8 years ago now?
No, it came out in 2020 during COVID, unfortunately.
Oh, really? Okay.
Pandemics happen when they will. But yeah, so 3 years ago. I've been working on it for about 8 years with the interview process and the writing process, though. That's right.
So where are you being drawn to next then, when you're thinking about what you're hearing from companies?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's interesting because I have always had I always have a lot of interests, but I've usually had a relatively singular focus in terms of the next area of work. And in this case, I have moved and now settled on the third and final place, that not final, but the third place where I'll be focusing the rest of the work for the foreseeable future. I had started out with thinking that I would be talking about grounded optimism, because I don't think that you can do any of this without grounded optimism. And we talk about the Stockdale paradox. Most of you know about that. But you must go into something believing in the end. You must go into that. So I thought I'd write about that, write another book about that. And then I decided it was more about courage, right? Because even if you have optimism, you've got to be willing to do the work and go out and make things happen. And that is also true. Where I have ultimately settled, and this is true because of a number of different factors, is that it really comes down to, and this is growing out of the work from COVID and beyond is this idea of purpose and explicating purpose and understanding purpose in a number of different ways, understanding why we've lost our purpose through a number of different, it's both psychological, it's philosophical, it's cultural, it's all of these different factors that have really kind of conspired to strip away purpose that we really held more, not uniformly, but more as a culture not too long ago, a couple decades ago at least. And how it is that we can find that again, how it is that we can inspire that in our organizations and in ourselves. And the studies are really clear from COVID that this lack of purpose connects directly to a lack of engagement, a lack of longevity, a lack of well-being, both mental and physical, a lack of relationship well-being, and a lack of performance at work. So conversely, of course, if we can find it again, we can find the positive sides of each of those areas.
One last question before we open it up to everyone else. And Anjuma just put something in that I thought was really worthy of us talking about a little bit. This idea of how do you select for people with grit or select for people with the ability to develop grit when you're looking at interviewing, et cetera. How do you think about that question?
I always believe that past performance is the best indicator of future, right? And so being sure that you can understand through your interview process and through references that the person that you're interviewing has a track record of success in grit. It doesn't have to be in your specific area, right? You can train that specific area, but it is harder to train, not impossible, but harder to train the mindset of grit and resilience and the entire spectrum of that grit triad. So I would select for it by looking at their past records and also by ensuring that the references would support what it is that they share in the interviews.
Okay, awesome. So Shannon, thanks a ton on that. I'll tell you where I failed today. I'll be vulnerable. I forgot to mention that you are offering us a couple of signed books that we're going to give away randomly to the people who are attending today. So in just a moment, Betsy will talk about who won those. But thanks a ton. This was an excellent conversation. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt. It's always a pleasure.